So I'll start out by talking about a journey that I've had really over the past year or so around how can we wrangle the sort of chaos of content in a company that is as big as Autodesk. We have about 10,000 people worldwide, and we have pretty much a decentralized model for how we deliver content. So the story starts out with my CMO, who was newly appointed and in the middle of an all-hands meeting. I don't remember the context, but she said, Dusty's gonna fix the content problem. I was like, oh, really? I wonder what that means to her. She's awesome. She's fantastic. She's brilliant. She's a wonderful marketer. And I've known her for years and worked with her when I was on the sort of product marketing side of the business. And so I thought, you know what? Probably a good idea for me to sit down with Lisa and try to understand what's on her mind, what she's thinking about. Again, she was an SVP of one of our BUs and stepped up into the CMO role. So she's got a very fresh perspective and also very familiar with the business and some of the challenges that she'd experienced in her own BU. So I started out by talking to her and trying to ultimately scope, what is this content problem that you're thinking of, and figure out if we could scope it. I'm really well aware. I've been living in content for years. I'm pretty aware of some of the gaps that we have and the challenges that we have at Autodesk. But let's figure out what's on Lisa's mind. So I started out by talking to her, and she brought up a bunch of different things that were absolutely on point. But a few of the ones that sort of stood out was she doesn't have visibility or really an understanding of who's creating our content within the organization, and also the types. So we just actually talked about what are the different types of content. I mean types in a more general term, in terms of like blog posts or ebooks, guides, infographics, that kind of thing. Who's creating what kind of content? She doesn't have a lot of visibility into that, and that's a great question. And frankly, given the decentralized nature of our organization, there isn't really a good answer there. The other question is our content getting used? You've probably heard a bunch of different times, what is it, 10% of your content drives 90% of your engagement, which means you're creating a whole bunch of content that's not driving any engagement or very little engagement and probably isn't worth the effort that you put into it. And then finally, are we duplicating efforts? So this kind of goes back to the idea of, who's creating what kind of content. If we may have people who are creating, more awareness / top of funnel type of content. Maybe some people creating some middle of funnel, some people creating bottom of funnel, but without clear visibility around who's creating what, it probably stands to reason that there are some duplicative efforts around content being created. And so again, those were all, she had a lot of different other questions to ask that were savvy, but what I decided to do was say, okay, Lisa, thank you. I'm going to go talk to some other people. I will ultimately come back to you and your team with a recommendation, but I need to do some research first. So then I sat down and I talked to her staff. And her staff had some similar questions, but they also had some different ones too. Her staff was thinking about things in terms of, how much are we actually spending on content? Somebody had mentioned earlier in one of their presentations today that that's not easily ascertainable, and I 100% agree. It's not easy to figure out, especially in a decentralized content model, how much we're actually spending on content. Just content creation, not even distribution. Just how much are we spending on content creation? The age-old question of where's the ROI? At the end of the day, that may sometimes be the wrong question to actually ask, but suffice it to say, it gets asked all the time. Where are we seeing a return on investment? In other words, what am I getting out of the content that I'm investing in with my team? And the last piece is, are we being efficient? Like, are we optimized? Are there things that we could be doing better, more efficiently to get more mileage out of the investment that we make around content? So again, talked to her entire staff. Then I went to essentially my peer group within the organization, which are essentially their staff. I focused mostly on marketing, but I did talk to folks in sales and some folks outside of sales in the customer success and support organizations. And the directors had some similar questions, but also had some unique ones of their own, which is, I don't really know how content gets created in my team. Again, some teams are outsourcing content and working with agencies and bringing great content to market. Others are creating it and creating content within their own teams, rolling up their sleeves and getting it done. But the whole process is sort of a black box. They don't have visibility into what essentially the production line looks like. And so they want to get some more visibility around that. At the same time, as we think about designing content for, say, different stages of a customer journey, where are the handoffs? Like, are those handoffs even happening? Do we know where the handoff happens from sort of that top of funnel / awareness content to be handed off into sort of middle of funnel and then down toward the conversion and acquisition, sort of the bottom of the funnel side of the piece? So where are those journey handoffs happening? And then the last sort of big question was, how can we make our content work harder? You have those sort of runaway pieces. I know that I certainly do. My team produces a publication that's really more of an owned media channel for Autodesk called Redshift. And we've been publishing content on this channel for maybe 6 or so years. And it's grown steadily and beautifully, and the content's got better over time. But there's always a few articles that just kill it, either from an SEO perspective or they just totally resonate with the audiences anytime we promote them. So trying to figure out, okay, with those runaway pieces, are we spending enough time actually looking at those and recycling those, right? I think the inherent challenge for us is that marketers love bright, shiny objects, right? We're a creative bunch, and we want to go out and we want to keep creating new things. And that can be a real challenge to say, hey guys, hang tight, don't create anything new, just pause and take everything that we already have and just repurpose it, tweak it, adjust it. You could probably keep your entire content program alive for months if you get really creative at how you do that. So again, how can our content work harder and us get more mileage out of it? Lastly, I went and talked with the actual managers and the individual contributors who are getting content done or managing our agency partners to help get content created. And their questions were also different, which was, how are other teams executing? Right? We've got content teams in silos because we're decentralized, and they don't really have good visibility over how their peers in a different industry are doing their thing. And the problem with that is that, it actually creates a variety of different problems, but one of the main things is they want to see what's working for that other group over there, and whether there's something they could learn from some of the successes that team's seen, and vice versa for that team. The other question that comes up, and especially comes up with more of the content consuming group, so like demand generation, who aren't terribly in the business of creating content. They're really taking content that's being created and building programs and campaigns around it. So their questions are, how do I find the content I need? Right? We've all heard the point that we need to deliver the right content to the right person at the right time. If you can't find it, that's going to be very, very difficult. And then finally, on the related side is, what are some of the technology and tools that we can use for content? And I know this close to my heart. I'm super interested in content technology. I know a lot of my peers are, and a lot of the teams who are rolling up their sleeves, getting the work done. They're always looking for more efficient ways to get things done, and so they're always looking at the latest technology to help them figure that out. So after having all of these conversations, I stepped back and I looked at some of our technology. And again, these logos really are just a small subset, frankly, of some of the kinds of tools that we're using just for the process of managing content and then asset storage. There's a bunch more, but these are some of the more obvious ones. And when I showed this slide, when I met back with my CMO and her staff and I showed them this, this was kind of this sort of clicked the light bulb for them, which is like, whoa, we really need to get our stuff together here. We've got all these different teams using different types of tools and different capacities, and in some cases we're just over-invested in in buying redundant technology, redundant software. So these are some of the challenges that we're seeing just stepping back and looking at just a small subset of the technology as part of a content stack. So summarize the findings and the needs that we captured. what are the different types of content? Who's accountable for that? How are we managing the quality and consistency of that content, especially in a decentralized model? How are we managing the process of content creation and then managing the assets that get produced through that process? How are we managing discoverability? How are we tracking usage? Is that stuff getting used or not getting used? And then, are our KPIs aligned? And the reality is no. Everybody's sort of got their own definition. Some teams have similar ideas of what success looks like, but essentially it's not really clear. And so you have teams comparing apples and oranges in terms of what success looks like. And that makes it really hard for us to scale as a business, which is something we know we need to do if we're going to get to that next level. So our action plan coming out of that conversation was, hey, we need to grow up, basically. We need to start acting like the, $2.7 billion company that we are with 10,000 people. We've been around 37 years. Turns out you can still teach an old dog new tricks. We're an old dog, but we got some new tricks. And we need to figure out ways where we can standardize so that we can get better quality, efficiency, discoverability, you name it. So I had some ideas, of course, after having these conversations. A lot of these questions weren't entirely new to me, and I did have some ideas of ways that we could tackle them. But before I came back with a recommendation, I thought, you know what? I'm going to ask the experts, because at the end of the day, there are people whose job it is, probably many of you in here, who do this day in and day out for different companies, who go in to sit down with big companies and help them solve this big, gnarly problem. So I did the same thing. I picked up my bat phone and I called a very, very special friend who may or may not be our keynote speaker at this presentation or at this conference, Mr. Robert Rose. And I said to Robert, hey, can I get your help with this? And Robert and the content advisory were awesome with this. And essentially sat down with Robert, shared with him what we'd learned. We brought in more people, took some more input from a variety of different teams. And ultimately, one of the things I asked Robert is I said, how do companies usually, like big companies, how do they organize around content? And I thought it was interesting. He said, essentially, you have kind of three models. I mean, we're oversimplifying here, but essentially there's sort of three ways that you might see companies organize around content. The first is thinking about, I think companies sort of like where we are at Autodesk, where we're essentially maybe like a rebel type of organization. We're decentralized. There are teams just in their own silos doing their own things, calling successes the way that they call them, and so on and so forth. Not a lot of conversations happening across teams. There's some, but there certainly could be much more. On the flip side, you have more of the centralized model, where you have, basically sort of an in-house content team that are taking requirements from across the business, and they are producing content and delivering that content to different teams that need it so they can go and execute and do what they need to do. And then the third is maybe something right in the middle, like a hybrid type of organization, where you have some things that are centralized and some things that remain decentralized. And ultimately, at Autodesk, I asked Robert, I said, what does your gut tell you in terms of what you've learned from us and the kind of company we are? And Robert had some really interesting points of view around this. And one thing that I thought was interesting was I said, could we be the type of company that could potentially pull off more of a centralized model? And I said, I think it was, what does it look like for a company that can actually pull that off? And Robert shared the point that one of the things that you would really need to be able to do to pull something like that off is have a really common narrative, right? A sort of a singular story that your entire organization is rallied around and going to market, and essentially just delivering that story to different audiences, right? Where you tweak it and you adjust it, but you have a singular narrative. I would argue at Autodesk that we sort of do, but again, I think our audiences are very different, but we do have a singular narrative around helping people sort of design and make, whether it's a film, whether it's a car, or whether it's a building or a part for a product. But at the end of the day, because we're a rebel organization and knowing how successful we've been with trying to centralize functions, it's really hard to pull off. So what we ultimately decided to do was go after trying to pivot from more of a rebel model to a hybrid model in terms of the way that we organize and structure ourselves. So we put together something we called Project Charlie internally, And this was our attempt to try to start to move the organization into deciding what components we might centralize and what components of the content production machine would remain decentralized.